The Germans put a price of 5 million francs on one civilian, not a general, not a trained spy, a woman who kept slipping through their hands and who was quietly building the most effective escape network in occupied France. She forged papers under their noses. She moved Allied airmen across borders the Germans believed were sealed. And every time the Gestapo tightened the net, another group of men vanished into the routes she had woven through cities, mountains, and safe houses no map could trace. To the soldiers she saved, she was a lifeline. To the Germans, she was a ghost. To Hitler, she became the woman he couldn't catch. Her name was Nancy Wake, the mind behind the secret network that would save nearly 1,000 Allied soldiers. Before the Germans ever knew her name, Nancy Wake looked nothing like the woman worth 5 million francs. In Paris, she moved through the world with a restless kind of joy, working as a foreign correspondent by day, drifting into crowded cafes and smoky dance halls by night. She loved the noise, the music, the late conversations that stretched until morning. Friends joked that Nancy never turned down a drink and never refused a bet. To most people, she seemed like someone who was simply enjoying the city while she was young enough to do it. But her assignments had taken her farther than Paris, to Vienna, to Berlin, to places where the mood was shifting long before the rest of Europe wanted to admit it. On the streets, she saw stormtroopers rough up Jewish families. She watched fear settle over entire neighborhoods. She filed stories, kept her notes, and returned to France with images she didn't talk about much, not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't sure anyone wanted to hear them. In Paris, those memories sat quietly underneath the surface while her life moved forward. She adopted a terrier named Pecan, found comfort in familiar cafes, and chased stories across the continent. And in the middle of it all, she met Henri Fiocca, a wealthy industrialist with a soft voice and a steady sort of charm. Their life together was easy in a way the world rarely is. Dinners in Marseille, weekends on the coast, long evenings where the future still felt wide open. Nancy kept traveling for work, kept watching Europe change from one city to the next. And even as she returned home to the warmth of Henri's world, the signs she'd been seeing abroad didn't fade. They stayed with her, quiet but present, as the atmosphere around Europe grew heavier day by day. By the time 1939 arrived, the sense of unease across Europe had become impossible to ignore. Headlines grew sharper, borders tightened, and in France, conversations that once drifted toward music and theater turned instead toward the possibility of war. Nancy was in England when the news finally broke. She stepped off a train at Paddington Station on September 3rd and found the platforms buzzing, with voices carrying only one message. Britain had declared war on Germany. She went back to France as quickly as she could. Henri brought her home to Marseille, and whatever remained of their quiet life settled into something more cautious. Stores rationed food. Radio stayed on longer at night. The pace of the city slowed under the weight of uncertainty. When Henri was called up for military service, Nancy refused to stay idle. She convinced him to buy her a car and had it converted into a small ambulance. For weeks, she drove wounded soldiers and terrified civilians away from advancing German forces. The work was exhausting, the sights far worse than anything she had seen as a reporter. It left no room for the Paris nights she once loved. By June 1940, France fell. German troops marched through cities that had seemed untouchable just months earlier. The country split in two, one half occupied, the other controlled by Vichy officials who cooperated with Berlin. Marseille changed quickly. Posters appeared on walls, checkpoints multiplied, strangers became cautious with their eyes and their words. Nancy and Henri felt the shift, along with everyone else, but she refused to let the new order settle quietly around her. Her first step into resistance work was small enough that it barely felt like a decision. A French officer still loyal to de Gaulle asked if she would carry an envelope on her next trip to Cannes. Nothing more. Just a delivery from one safe set of hands to another. Nancy agreed, slipped the envelope into her things, and began planning the journey. What started as a simple favor grew quietly into something larger. Nancy began delivering more letters, more parcels, more messages that passed through Marseille's hidden networks. Nothing about the work felt dramatic. It felt practical, a way to keep people connected in a country where trust was thinning by the day. Through these errands, she met Allied airmen who had been shot down over France. Some were injured, some simply lost, all trying to avoid the patrols sweeping the region. Nancy and Henri offered what they could: a meal, a bed, a place to wait while forged papers were arranged. Their home became a safe stop on a route that didn't officially exist. Eventually, the people running that route introduced themselves. One was a Scottish officer named Ian Garrow. Another was a Belgian going by Patrick O'Leary. Together, they managed an underground network guiding Allied servicemen out of France, across the Pyrenees, and into Spain, the line that would eventually take O'Leary's name. Nancy didn't join with any grand announcement. She simply kept helping, one task at a time. She knew how to move through Marseille without attracting attention, which streets were safer, which shopkeepers could be trusted, which officials were less vigilant than they appeared. Even those who once doubted her seriousness began to see how easily she handled situations that made others hesitate. Travel across the region became routine. She carried forged identity cards, ration books, and messages folded so small they could hide inside a coat seam. Sometimes she boarded crowded buses. Other times she slipped into quiet hotels where Allied escapees waited for direction. Her manner never raised suspicion. She looked like someone on an ordinary errand, moving through an ordinary day. It was quiet work, careful work, rarely urgent on the surface, but every successful handoff pushed another man a little farther away from German reach. And as the number of escapees grew, so did the recognition inside the resistance that Nancy Wake was becoming one of its most reliable couriers. The O'Leary line was never stable for long. Too many moving parts, too many people risking everything in a country where a wrong look could end a life. When word reached Nancy that Ian Garrow had been arrested, the shift inside the network was immediate. Messages slowed, routes froze. Airmen who were supposed to be moved south were suddenly stuck in safe houses with nowhere to go. Garrow faced solitary confinement, transfer to a harsher camp, and a sentence he likely wouldn't survive. He managed to get a message out, a plea for help, thin and desperate, and it found its way into Nancy's hands. Henri wasn't happy. Helping downed airmen was one thing. Breaking someone out of a prison camp was something entirely different. But Nancy had already made up her mind. She posed as Garrow's cousin and traveled to the camp at Marsac. The first visit didn't get her far. Guards were suspicious, the prison routines tight. She returned a second time, watched their habits more carefully, and waited for someone who might be persuaded. It didn't take long. One guard approached her quietly, hinting he could help, if she paid. The price was staggering. 500,000 francs, with a large portion up front. Nancy didn't have enough, so she wired Henri for the remaining amount. It was a dangerous request for a woman already drawing attention, and the transaction nearly got her detained. She escaped suspicion only by pretending the money was settling a bar debt, an excuse bold enough to work. Once the bribe was secured, the guard arranged the rest. A uniform smuggled inside, a shift change with a momentary blind spot, a car waiting beyond the gates. Garrow walked out, dressed as one of the men guarding him, stepped into the vehicle Nancy had prepared, and disappeared into the countryside. By the time authorities realized what had happened, he was already on the path toward Spain. The escape stunned the camp. And somewhere inside the Gestapo's nightly reports, a new problem appeared. A woman who could bribe their guards, fool their police, and free a prisoner they had considered locked down. It was the first time the Germans officially acknowledged her existence. It would not be the last. Garrow's escape didn't stay quiet for long, and inside Gestapo offices, Nancy's name began circulating more often, always paired with the same figure, 5 million francs for anyone who could bring her in. It wasn't an official announcement on posters. It didn't need to be. In occupied France, numbers like that traveled on their own. Small changes started to appear around Marseille, a faint click on the telephone line, a man who lingered a little too long across the street, a mailbox left open at dawn, envelopes scattered as if someone had been searching without the nerve to take anything. None of it was proof. But all of it together shifted the air in a way Nancy couldn't ignore. Patrols moved differently. Vichy officers tried to act casual in cafes, where she used to meet contacts. Clerks at familiar shops took an extra moment before handing back her change. Not unfriendly, just unsure. Nancy adjusted the way she lived. She stopped walking the same route home twice in a row. She changed buses halfway through a ride, even when it slowed her down. She kept conversations short, especially with people who seemed a little too comfortable asking questions. Henri noticed the differences before she said anything. He saw how she paused before answering the phone, how she scanned the street before unlocking the door, how she slept less deeply than before. They didn't talk about it directly. The walls in Marseille were never quiet enough for honesty, but both understood the same thing. The space around Nancy Wake was narrowing. One friend quietly warned her that someone had been following her movements for several days. Another mentioned hearing her name in conversations she wasn't meant to be part of. The signs weren't dramatic, but they pointed in one direction. Nancy didn't panic. She simply listened, stored the information, and began preparing for what was coming. Leaving France meant leaving Henri. There was no dramatic farewell, no long conversation, only a quiet parting in a house where both of them understood the risk of saying too much. Even standing close felt dangerous when she wasn't sure who might be listening. Nancy packed what she could carry, hid money inside her clothing, and stepped into the street with the calm of someone who'd already accepted what had to happen. For years, she'd helped other people escape. Now it was her turn to move. Nancy had helped dozens of men reach the Pyrenees. But when the route became hers, everything that once worked began to fall apart. The first attempt stalled before it even left Toulouse. Patrols were heavier than usual, and a familiar checkpoint suddenly had new faces, men who watched too closely when she passed. She turned back before anyone could stop her. The second try was worse. A sudden sweep shut down the station where she was supposed to meet her guides. No warning, no explanation. Just uniformed men standing where civilians should have been. Attempts 3 and 4 collapsed the same way. Guides missing, suspicious delays, detours that didn't feel accidental. Someone was tightening the net, and Nancy could feel the space closing around her. The fifth attempt became the breaking point. Her train was stopped without warning, the doors thrown open by Vichy police. Passengers were pushed into trucks, questioned, separated. Nancy kept her real name, kept her story simple, and kept her voice steady. It didn't matter. She was taken anyway. Inside the station basement, the interrogations came quickly. Accusations shifted by the hour: spy, courier, accomplice. At one point, they accused her of bombing a cinema. Another time, of being a prostitute from Lourdes. No logic, just pressure. When that didn't work, they beat her. Not enough to break bones, just enough to break time into long, hurting pieces. On the fourth day, she was pulled from her cell and told to wait in the hallway. When she looked up, she saw Patrick O'Leary in the corridor. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even let her face change. If they connected the two of them, the entire network would burn. O'Leary walked past her without a glance. Minutes later, he was in the commissioner's office, claiming she was his lover, frightened into silence because her jealous husband might find out. It was absurd. And because it was absurd, it worked. Nancy walked out of the station beside him, arm in arm, as if nothing had happened. But Toulouse was no longer safe. Neither was the next city, or the next. The sixth attempt came with gunfire. A railway official warned them that Germans were stopping the train ahead. There was no time for a plan, only the open door and the slowing tracks beneath them. They jumped. Dirt slammed into her shoulder. Shots cracked through the air as she and the others sprinted into nearby vineyards, hiding among the rows until night swallowed the fields. That run ended the same way as the others. Another safe house, another regrouping, another start. But on the seventh try, after days of walking at night, freezing wind, and losing even her handbag in the dark, she finally crossed the river into Spain. For the first time in months, the danger behind her felt farther away than the danger ahead. Spain wasn't the end of the journey. It was a holding place, a narrow strip of safety before whatever came next. Nancy was arrested again almost immediately, thrown into a local jail with no food and no explanation. But the British managed to pull strings, pay bribes, and get her released. Within weeks, she reached Madrid, then Gibraltar, and finally England. London felt nothing like the France she had left. It was louder, colder, and full of soldiers who moved with purpose. Nancy didn't want rest. She didn't want a desk. She wanted a way back into the war. She tried joining the Free French first, but the door shut quickly. Too chaotic, too political. Too many people who didn't know what to do with a woman who had survived 6 failed escape attempts and a prison interrogation. But someone else was paying attention. The Special Operations Executive, the organization Churchill built to set Europe ablaze, saw what others had missed. They didn't care about protocol. They cared about results. And Nancy had already done more in occupied France than many trained agents. Her interview was brief. Her acceptance even shorter. Then came the training. Scotland's hills became her classroom, cold, wet, and unforgiving. Days started with lectures on sabotage and ended with weapons drills that stretched past midnight. She learned to assemble explosives by feel alone, to fire a pistol in tight quarters, to break a sentry's grip, and, if necessary, to break a sentry's neck. They taught her to parachute. They taught her to move silently in forests. They taught her how to kill a man quickly and how to disappear before anyone noticed. Some instructors doubted her at first. She was too cheerful, too confident, too willing to argue. But then they watched her climb cliffs faster than anyone else. Watched her hit a bullseye with a pistol after days without sleep. Watched her push herself long after the others stopped. One of them said it quietly, but everyone heard it. She's reckless, but exactly the kind of reckless we need. Nancy didn't argue. She didn't boast. She simply kept going, learning each skill as if she'd already planned to use it. And soon enough, she would. When Nancy finally returned to France, it wasn't through a checkpoint or a train station. She dropped from the night sky. On the night of April 29th, 1944, she and her fellow SOE agent, Major John Hubert Farmer, parachuted into the Auvergne region, a dark stretch of hills and forests where German patrols passed often enough to keep the locals on edge. Nancy hit the ground hard, bruised but unshaken. The war she left months earlier had only grown harsher. They were supposed to meet a contact named Hector, who would lead them to Gaspard, commander of a large Maquis force. But nothing went the way London had promised. Hector wasn't prepared. Their courier never arrived. And the radio operator assigned to work with them was off spending the week with a local boyfriend. No radio, no money, no supplies. Just two agents in the middle of France with nothing but their training and whatever help they could convince others to give. Nancy and Hubert went searching on their own. When they finally found Gaspard, the reception was chilly. He hadn't been told to expect SOE agents. He didn't know who they were or what they could offer. And without a functioning radio to call down supply drops, they were of little use to him. But then, the missing operator reappeared, breathless and apologetic. With the radio back online, London began sending weapons and crates of equipment in nighttime airdrops. Nancy spent night after night on a mountain plateau, hauling canisters across rough ground, cracking them open, and wiping grease from brand new British Sten guns before handing them out to the Maquis fighters. The work was dirty, repetitive, and essential, and once the region was armed, the real operations began. Nancy joined raids on convoys, cut telephone lines, helped plan demolitions, and moved between camps where hundreds of men were preparing for the fighting they knew was coming. She earned a place in the group not through speeches, but through endurance, walking for miles, sleeping little, always willing to carry more than her share. One sentry didn't survive meeting her. In the dark, when a patrol stumbled too close, she used a move the instructors had drilled into her endlessly, a sharp judo strike to the base of the neck. She had practiced it in training. She never expected it to kill him. It did. Another night, she slipped into a German gun factory through a back entrance and tossed in a handful of grenades before sprinting out again. The blast tore through the building and wrecked equipment the Germans were desperate to keep running. Little by little, the Maquis in the region grew stronger, better supplied, and more coordinated. And whether they admitted it or not, many of them began looking to Nancy as one of the steady hands in the chaos. She didn't ask for authority. She simply showed up every day, ready to work, same as always. By the summer of 1944, the fighting around Auvergne had turned relentless. German patrols pressed harder, supply lines were threatened, and during one chaotic withdrawal, the Maquis were forced to bury their radio set, the only link between Nancy's group and London. Without it, they were blind. No supply drops, no intelligence, no way to warn the Allies what was happening in the region. London needed a situation report. The Maquis needed weapons and reinforcement, and someone had to cross enemy territory to reach the nearest functioning radio operator. No one volunteered, not because they were unwilling, but because the task looked impossible. Nancy didn't argue. She just took the bicycle. There was no escort, no cover story, no guarantee she would even make it through the first checkpoint. She set off as the sun was beginning to rise, pedaling alone along narrow country roads where German trucks rolled through without warning. The route stretched across more than 500 kilometers of rough ground, hills, valleys, small towns crawling with soldiers, and long stretches of countryside where a lone cyclist could be spotted from far away. Nancy avoided checkpoints, slipped around roadblocks, and hid behind stone walls whenever she heard engines approaching. She rode through the day and didn't stop at night. There was no time to rest. Her legs shook, her hands blistered. The seams of her shorts tore into her skin until every turn of the pedals felt like a knife. But she kept going. When she finally reached the operator, exhausted and running on instinct alone, she delivered the coded message. The Maquis needed a new transmitter, ammunition, and immediate supply drops. It was all business, no dramatics, just the facts. Then she turned around and started back. The return was slower, not from hesitation, but from fatigue so deep she struggled to stay upright. She hid in barns, behind hedgerows, in drainage ditches. At one point, she nearly collapsed on the road before forcing herself up again and pushing forward. By the time she reached her group, days had passed. She was bruised, dehydrated, and barely able to walk. But the Maquis had their connection to London restored, and British aircraft were already preparing supply drops. Nancy never boasted about the ride. When asked later, she simply said it was the one thing in the war she remained proud of, not because of heroism, but because she didn't think she had it in her until she did it. The weeks after Nancy's ride didn't bring relief. They brought a fight the Maquis had been expecting, but hoped would never come. German forces moved into the region in numbers that dwarfed anything the resistance had faced before. Thousands of infantry, armored cars, artillery, even Luftwaffe support circling overhead. Their orders were clear: crush the Maquis before their attacks could threaten the lines of communication feeding the front. The first major clash hit near Montluçon. Gaspard's fighters held the ridges and forests, using every ditch and tree line they knew. They struck convoys, cut roads, delayed patrols, and pulled back before the Germans could lock them down. But the pressure didn't ease. Every mile the Germans advanced came with more men, more vehicles, more firepower. The fighting stretched for hours, sometimes for entire days. Nancy was everywhere the group needed her, checking on outposts, moving ammunition, relaying orders from one pocket of Maquis fighters to another. Shells tore into the hillsides, villages burned, but the resistance didn't scatter. They held the line long enough to inflict serious losses before regrouping deeper in the countryside. Rumors of D-Day reached them not through official channels, but through whispered news from locals who had heard broadcasts on hidden radios. The landings didn't end the war in central France. They only intensified the urgency on both sides. German units became more aggressive. Maquis operations grew bolder, hitting supply convoys, rail lines, and isolated outposts. Through it all, Nancy stayed focused. Her job wasn't to inspire speeches or lead charges. It was to keep the groups moving, supplied, and in contact with London, a quiet kind of leadership built on grit instead of ceremony. By August, the German grip on the region began to loosen. Units withdrew, checkpoints vanished. Some patrols simply disappeared into the retreat toward the east. And then, almost suddenly, the balance shifted. Vichy collapsed. Maquis units moved into towns that had been under German control for years. Civilians flooded the streets, cheering fighters who had lived in the hills and forests for so long that some barely remembered what it felt like to walk openly through a crowd. Liberation didn't arrive with celebration for Nancy. It arrived with a truth she had been trying not to imagine. Somewhere between the marches into newly freed towns and the settling of old accounts, word finally reached her. Henri had been arrested months earlier, taken by the Gestapo, interrogated, tortured, and executed for refusing to give up anything about her. There was no detailed report, no last message, just the fact that he had stayed silent and paid for it. Nancy didn't break down. She didn't make a scene. She simply listened, let the weight of the news settle, and held herself still in a way that had nothing to do with shock. The grief was there, sharp and personal, but she carried it the same way she carried everything else during the war, quietly, without wasting motion. People around her tried to offer comfort. She thanked them, but none of their words reached the part of her where Henri now lived. Later she would say she felt responsible, not because she had chosen the fight, but because Henri had chosen to stand beside her without hesitation. She never wished he had done anything differently, and she never wished she had, either. What she regretted was simple, that he hadn't lived to see France free again. But the war wasn't over, not fully, and there was still work to finish. Nancy stayed with the resistance fighters as they secured the last towns in the region, her loss tucked away like something she would deal with when there was finally room to breathe. When the fighting finally settled, Nancy didn't slip quietly into the background the way some wartime heroes did. She stayed on, helping consolidate the last resistance groups, organizing supply lists, and smoothing the transition as Allied units restored order across the region. The work felt different now, less urgent, less frantic, but she treated it with the same discipline she had given everything since the day France fell. In the months that followed, the world began trying to rebuild itself. Nancy didn't celebrate much. She left France for a time, worked briefly for British intelligence, and then tried her hand at politics in Australia. Nothing ever held her for long. She had spent years living on instinct and momentum, and the quiet of civilian life didn't quite fit. Eventually, she settled in London, in an apartment that overlooked a street busy enough to keep her from feeling boxed in. People who met her late in life often didn't realize who she was until someone else mentioned it. By then, she was in her 80s and still ordering gin at noon, slipping into conversations with the same dry humor she'd used in Marseille half a century earlier. She didn't talk much about medals or operations or the number of men she'd helped escape. If someone pushed, she usually shrugged. It was a war, she'd say. We all had a job. But France remembered, the Maquis remembered, the airmen she guided out of the country remembered. They knew her not as the socialite from Paris nights, not as the woman the Germans mocked, but as the person who fooled the Gestapo, defied occupation, and helped bring nearly 1,000 men home alive. Her ashes were scattered in the mountains where she once rode through checkpoints with forged papers in her pocket, the same ridges where she had trained fighters, gathered weapons, and pushed back an army that had underestimated her from the start. And in that quiet stretch of French countryside, the legend of the White Mouse settled into the landscape she had reclaimed, not dramatic, not loud, just unmistakably hers.